In 3.2, we're looking at the molecules of life. These are the different basic molecular structures that are going to fuel the body, make the body work, and run the different processes that make an organism actually be alive. So the first one we're going to look at are the carbohydrates, something that most everyone's probably familiar with in terms of food. So if we look at sugars and breads and pastas, those are typical carbohydrates. But on a molecular level, a carbohydrate is going to be a compound that is made up of one carbon, two hydrogens, and one oxygen in some combination. These are a main source of energy for most organisms. So if we look at these different samples, we've got, again, these different points are different places where carbons are located, and then we see the other elements bonded to those carbons. So here we've got OH is bonded to carbon, O bonded to carbon. So we've got a single unit. Here we've got two units put together, and here we've got a long chain, or that polymer that we looked at in the last section. Again, single units combine to make more complex carbohydrates. So first of all, one unit or a simple sugar is going to be called a monosaccharide, mono meaning one. And so that's just one of those rings forming a specific type of carbohydrate. So for example, glucose is the energy or the carbohydrate that fuels the cell. Fructose is the sugars found in fruits, and galactose is the monosaccharide found in milk. Disaccharides are two monosaccharides put together to form a carbohydrate. And so here we have lactose. Some polysaccharides that you might be familiar with. Here again, we're looking at chains of monosaccharides put together. Starch, cellulose, or glycogen. That glycogen is going to be energy that's stored in our muscles or our liver for quick energy use. Starches are going to be carbohydrates that are made by plants to store energy. And then cellulose is a type of carbohydrate that makes up typically like the stalks or stems or the woody type of plants. The next type of biological molecule is the protein. Proteins are going to be made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And so here you can see meats and eggs and beans are all typical types of proteins. And these are going to be linked with monomers that are called amino acids. And so they also make up our skin and hair and muscles and things like that. If we look at this, the long chain that we see here, that is that protein chain, and it's made up of amino acids, which are the individual monomers. Here we can see the structure of one amino acid. So we've got our central carbon, and we've got that amino group, a carboxyl group, and then this functional group that's going to change the properties of the amino acids to give us different types of amino acids. So again, looking at that functional group that changes the properties, it's going to give us up to 20 different possible amino acids. Then we can look at what's called a peptide bond, and that peptide bond is going to bind those amino acids together. So it's going to combine the oxygen on one, two hydrogens on another, and complete that peptide bond. When we're looking at a polypeptide, we're looking at a long chain of those amino acids bonded together, and this makes up that protein. Enzymes are to help speed up biological reactions. So a catalyst is something that makes a reaction go faster, And so an enzyme is a special kind of catalyst for those biological reactions. If we look at this picture, a substrate is the reaction that we're trying to speed up, and the enzyme is what's going to speed that up. So where those come together and fit like a puzzle piece is called an active site. So only a specific enzyme will work with a specific reaction or substrate. If they don't match up, then it won't help speed up the reaction. When that substrate mixes with the enzyme, it weakens the bonds in that reaction and helps to speed that reaction up, so it will occur faster. There are many reactions in our body that if we didn't have enzymes to speed them up, they would occur too slowly for our body to even function. Lipids are the next type of biological molecule. These are non-polar, and that's important because that means that they're not going to mix with water. So when you think of fats and oils, those don't mix with water. That's because they're non-polar molecules. They are going to store more energy than anything else. So when you think of fat in your body, that is storing energy. So it's a good thing up to a certain point. And there are 5 main types that we're going to look at. This first type, we're looking at fatty acids, and they are an unbranched carbon chain. And what that means is if you look at this picture, we don't have any other elements coming off of this main branch other than the hydrogens. One thing about a fatty acid, we have one end that is attracted to water, this carboxyl group, and the other end does not like water. It's not going to mix. So if the water is on one end, it won't combine, but the other end it might. We have 2 types of those fatty acids, saturated and unsaturated, and that goes back to looking at that branch. So if we're looking at a saturated fatty acid, if we look at all of these different carbons, every single one of them has all 4 bonds filled up. So they are saturated with hydrogens. If we're looking at unsaturated, we have a part here, we can see this one doesn't have that extra hydrogen on the side. It's bonded with that carbon. So it's not full of all of the possible hydrogens that it could be. So that's considered to be unsaturated. This special type is called a triglyceride, and you might have heard that in terms of health. So a triglyceride is going to actually have 3 different fatty acids on that molecule. Some examples of triglycerides are going to be butters, red meat, fats, so typically solids if they are saturated. If they are unsaturated, if they have some of those breaks like we looked at in the last slide, those are going to be unsaturated fatty acids, and those are typically found in plants. The next type of lipid to look at is a phospholipid. And so this phospholipid is a little bit different than the triglycerides. This has 2 long fatty acid groups, but the third extension is a phosphate group. So we've got that phosphorus on there. And when we look at this structure, it looks a little bit different. It has that phosphate group on the end, kind of like a head, and then those fatty acids are like tails, almost. And so this is going to be polar, where it will mix with water, and then down here, non-polar, so it will not. Those will then be used to make a bilayer, or a layer of 2 of those phospholipids. So those polar heads will be on the outside, making them able to attract water. And then kind of the tails, or the fatty acids, will allow spaces that things can flow through. And this is going to make up our cell membrane. And so that's what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So 2 layers of these phospholipids make up our cell membrane. And so it's not just one solid wall, it's almost porous so things can flow back and forth. The next group of lipids are waxes, and waxes are going to be long chains of fatty acids, and they're going to have what's called an alcohol group as its functional group on the end. These are going to, again, repel water, and so they make things waterproof. If we think of waxy coatings on leaves, those to help give a waterproof type layer on leaves. The next type of biological molecule we're going to look at are steroids. These are composed of carbon rings. So again, each of those points are where a carbon molecule would be. And so all of these rings put together make up steroids. A lot of times we think of steroids as in bodybuilding, making us bigger, but steroids are important for other functions in our body as well. So yes, we have testosterone, but cortisone, if you think of cortisone creams, if you have an itch, hydrocortisone. Vitamin D is actually a steroid, as well as cholesterol. Then we have nucleic acids, which are used in DNA. So these are very long chains of the monomers of those nucleotide groups. And the nucleotide groups are going to be made up of phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and then ring-shaped nitrogen bases. So if we look at that nucleotide, what does one unit look like? So here we have those nitrogen bases. You can see the ends. We have that sugar, and we have our phosphate group. And that's going to make up DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So it's going to determine all of the characteristics of different organisms. RNA is similar, but it's kind of like a half of a DNA. And this is going to store information to help that DNA manufacture proteins. So if we look in more detail at DNA, you can see there are 4 types of those bases: thymine, adenine, and then we have cytosine and guanine. And they have those sugars and the nitrogen bases and the phosphates all attached. And those then combine to make up that twisted ladder to make DNA. So if we look back at our main types of biological molecules, we've got the monomers making the polymers. So sugars, monosaccharides are going to make those polysaccharides. Fatty acids are going to make up more complex fats and lipids in that cell membrane. Amino acids combine to make proteins, and nucleotides combine to make nucleic acids.